It is a good idea to start at this point our second day of the UNIRE conference in Trento. Again, let me say that I'm very happy that we're launching this network in this way. We've done fruitful work yesterday, and things look promising ahead, even though the task is really huge. A lot of work is ahead of all of us, especially you students. We haven't even started scratching the surface of this big problem. So it is exciting for those of you who are writing research projects, because there's a lot of material to be researched that hasn't nearly been explored yet. Okay, this was just to take the time so that more people are joining us. Great, good morning. And now it is my pleasure to let panel 2 start with the first 2 speakers. Katrin Wieden from the University of Linköping and Amadine Lebelec from Trento, here, a doctoral student in our international studies program, right? Okay, so as you know, you have 15 minutes. Then we'll let the other 2 speakers present, and we will have half an hour discussion of the 4 papers. Okay, please, Katrin.
How can I start it?
You want the presentation mode? You want the presentation mode? Go down there. Okay, look at my chat.
No, it disappeared.
Like that?
Okay, maybe.
And then you scroll down.
Maybe visualize.
Use the arrows.
Okay, great.
Okay?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. You need the microphone, please.
Hello. So as we talked yesterday, we have like a cultural issue in the mainstream society concerning gender-based violence, like this.
Yes, you have a very soft voice.
Okay, so I will talk louder. And this is why some queer or feminist communities build safe spaces, and this is what I will be talking about now, because there are discussions on how they work and if they are actually reproducing old inequalities or even producing new ones. So this is my overview. I'm first talking about mainstream narrations. Then I will talk about how safe spaces try to avoid them or try to make up new narrations. Then I will talk about specific queer locations and how they are. So queer locations is like not locations in space per se, but more like based on intersectionality. So a location is, for example, where a line of sexuality and gender are crossing. So that's a location. So a queer location might be bisexuality with being female or identifying as female. And so then finally we will draw some conclusions. The mainstream narrations are binarily discussing sexuality, gender and sex. So there's always like a male and a female side, and it's very heteronormative. So meaning that everyone is discussed as being heterosexual, and that there would be like a sharp difference between female and male persons. And especially for women, they are discussed there as either very chaste or as hypersexual. So for example, in narrations of slut shaming or victim blaming. So this is why safe spaces were produced or were structured. And they actually come from psychological work and social work, from like houses for example, women who were suffering from domestic violence, to give them an environment where they can like live in peace or can live different forms of interaction without being afraid of violence or any other thing. In line with this, they are structured as separate spaces, like they are separate from the mainstream environment, also in like buildings separate from other spaces, and they are structured in the presence, in line with like Butler's work. They are very much focusing on performance and how we can re-perform or perform differently, how sexuality, gender, and sex play out, and how they are lived. And they rely on power lines. So similar to mainstream culture, they try to use power lines to secure certain locations, to secure certain people. And they can be anything, like they're bars as queer spaces, so they are like housing projects, there are organizational spaces, there are different ways of making up or opening a safe space. And these rules, to relate them to, or to secure locations from mainstream narrations, they actually rely very much on being anti-heteronormative. And this, for example, it is not allowed to, or not allowed in some way, to perform heteronormatively, in order to instead allow more queer locations to perform within these spaces. And this is because we say, or queer spaces and people who are working or living therein, they say that in mainstream narrations, heteronormative practices are so strong and they are like so ingrained in our brains and in our acts that we need a space that actually excludes them and specifically tries to reduce them, so that we can live up new forms and that we're not re-narrating inequalities of the mainstream society. So, but then, if these spaces, like until now it sounds like this would be a great plan and we're just like having all these queer locations and we're just giving them like a new room where they can live out. But in fact there are like some locations which are struggling with this form of performance and of anti-performance. And mainly these are, for example, bisexual desire, trans or inter people, gender flexibility, gender non-conforming people, and this for several reasons, which I will discuss now. So the first one is that based on performance, people are often discussed as or viewed as passing. So, for example, if a person goes inside one of these rooms, he or she or it or whatever is going to be viewed as either female or male, in order to identify if this person is actually reproducing an old inequality that we do not want to have anymore, or if it's actually living like a new form of equality or openness, which we would like to support. So by trying to avoid inequality and by judging people based on their appearance, we actually make like reproducing the old inequalities, because we just take like attributions or of like how people do behave, how people are dressed and stuff, to judge their gender identity or their gender performance, their sexuality, all these kind of things. So this actually essentializing common narrations, and it's making it difficult, for example, for people who are like on the margins who cannot identify with the strict binary narration of gender. And it, for example, simplifies biographies because, like in one case, there was a discussion if trans men who appear very much in mainstream narrations as male, if they are still allowed to enter in safe spaces, or if they should leave them because they could like pass in mainstream society as male without any problems, and this is why they shouldn't get back there. And it's like really difficult because it narrates mainstream narrations as if they would be paradise, and if everyone would like to live within the mainstream narrations we still have. And the same accounts for sexual desire. So, for example, bisexual desire is often discussed as either heterally or homosexually performing. And just as in mainstream narrations, bisexual people are then asked to prove if they are really bisexual. It's like neglecting that bisexuality would even exist. So, for example, if a person who was priorly judged as being female would like be in contact or flirt with a person who is judged as being male, this would or might be understood as a heterosexual performance. And I argue that this is very different or difficult for bisexual people because it means they always need to judge how they are being viewed and how the other person is being viewed, and if this desire is now heterosexual or if it's homosexual. And excluding this form of like called hetero performance from safe spaces actually leads to excluding bisexuality and instead asking them to perform like or to live part of their sexuality in mainstream narrations, and it neglects like all the power hierarchies we do have in mainstream narrations and makes it difficult for people to break them. And then finally there's like a third thing, which is that in some safe spaces it's asked to not like, because for example people high in power hierarchies who are for example of male, cis male people and who are heterosexual, they are asked to not even enter in safe spaces. And if they are, for example, together with someone who would perfectly fit into these safe spaces, they can either not enter together, or if they do enter, they are supposed to not show that they are a couple, to not give power back to like these higher hierarchies. But in fact, this means that like the other person who is who these safe spaces were produced for cannot live out her or his sexuality only based on the partner's position in power hierarchy. So concluding from all this means that identities and sexual desire and sex are split again into binary narrations, and that there's a constant need to reflect and to judge. And I would say that this leads to essentialism, like to re-essentialize locations of people. And it also leads to a form of objectifying the self, because I'm constantly concerned with how I will appear to other people, and if this will make them feel uncomfortable, or if I'm going against any rule. And it's like exactly the opposite of what queer spaces actually were trying to do. Then it often sees queer people as victims, like if they cannot, for example, choose to be with someone high in power hierarchy, because they would always be like narrated as lower than their partner, and mainstream society is narrated as paradise, as I said before. And I would argue that all this leads to a new form of mistrust, which is already like a problem in mainstream society, and which we actually try to avoid. So this is it. And if you have questions, you're free to ask now or later.
I would advise that if you can hold on to questions, unless there is a pressing question only regarding clarification, but let's have discussion afterwards. Thank you very much, Catherine. Next speaker is Amandine.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Amandine Lebellec. I'm a PhD student here at the University of Trento. And I'm very glad to present you, well, a part of the research I conducted for my MA at Sciences Po Paris, where I studied asylum law reform and gender and sexuality in France. So my specific focus today will be on women, and more precisely on lesbian, bisexual, and transgender women in the French asylum system. As you may have noticed, we've had a lot of ongoing discussions around migration and asylum in Europe, in particular since 2015. But women, sexual minorities, and even more women from sexual minorities were almost absent from this discussion. So, it is still a very important issue because according to the Organization Refuge, Asylum and Migration, in 2012, they estimated that around 175 million people were LGBT, were living under a persecutory context. You have a map here from ILGA Europe showing it's only about law. Unfortunately, it's not about social situation, which may vary too. It is possible for those people now to claim asylum on the ground of social group, so for the Geneva Convention, and to be attributed the status of refugee and be granted protection in a country that does not criminalize or penalize same-sex behaviors or non-conforming identities. However, researchers have shown that those people are still facing discrimination and violence even within asylum system, the very systems that are supposed to grant them protection. So my question was basically, what was the situation of LGBT asylum seekers in France, and what are the political and cultural factors that may impact their specific protection? So I focused on the asylum law reform of 2015 that you have heard about with Myra a bit yesterday, but the focus is different today. And I conducted 36 interviews in 2017 with different politicians, institutional actors, NGOs, and finally academics. So my first step was really to try to understand the specific challenges of those asylum seekers, and then, because there is no documentation on their situation, and then try to understand how and why did France adopt a specific path in their protection, and what's the impact of this path. So first, a few elements regarding the legal and policy framework, which I think is useful to keep in mind. The primary paradox here is that even though asylum institutions are in charge of foreigners by definition, researchers, as I told you, have documented xenophobic, homophobic, sexist, and racist behaviors still taking place in those institutions. The Istanbul Convention took that into account, and through the Article 60, tried to let's say, improve a bit the situation of LGBT and women asylum seekers in general in the European asylum systems. So there were three main obligations, which was recognizing gender-based violence as a form of persecution. This wasn't self-evident in international law. Adopting a gender-sensitive approach to each of the convention grounds, developing a gender-sensitive reception procedure, support services, and guidelines. A few months later, the EU ratified the convention, and it was the 2011 Qualification Directive and 2013 Qualification Directive took those aspects into account, and then it was supposed to be transposed into national member states' laws. Fortunately, because LBT claims in France have started since the 90s, so 20 years before the Istanbul Convention. So before the convention, asylum institutions already took some steps towards the protection of LBT asylum seekers. In particular, at the OFPRA, which is the Office for Asylum and Stateless People, the role of the new general director, Pascal Brice, has been decisive. He established working groups on gender and sexual orientations, consulted associations, he went to visit associations actually, and he also accredited gender and gender-based and sexuality related associations to come with the asylum seekers to defend them at the office. At the CNDA, it's a bit less structured in terms of policies, because the hierarchical power is really less strong. So you have more flexibility, let's say, for the better and for the worst. You've had some trainings for officers, but not so much since then. So as you see, those policies are mainly, let's say, specific and ad hoc, and they can be also quite limited and fragile because they really highly depends on the goodwill of the people who are in charge of the matter. However, despite the policies, all associations have reported continuing homophobic behaviors within asylum institutions. And this may be understood, you need to take into account France's ambiguous relationship to sexual and gender minorities to really understand what is going on in the asylum system right now. As Pierre Albertini put it, as a liberal and revolutionary power, France is the first country to depenalize homosexuality in Europe, but as a Catholic and Latin country, it has traditionally associated with sin and dishonor. So homosexuality has been penalized and depenalized several times during French history, showing progression and regression at the same time, even within very short amounts of time. You have to know that final depenalization of homosexuality is in the 80s, and that the De Gaulle government, the liberation government, actually reinforced sanctions against homosexuality. Now, though, you still have a relatively positive a priori towards LGBT claimants that are seen as, more vulnerable, and you have no frontal opposition to them, including by associations that are opposed to gay marriage, for example. But you do have a persistence of homophobia, as long as you take homophobia as a continuum, not just as pure violence. You do have violence, you do have judges who will discard applications just because someone is homosexual. I've heard that. And I believe it is true from what I've heard. But you do have more generalized prejudices, I would say. One of my interviewees, who is very active in an association, told me about the questions, I'm not going to put it softly, it's better at the OFPRA than at the court, because at the court it's a caricature and it's obscene. So I let you imagine the kind of questions that can be asked. And it was actually acknowledged by a judge at the CNDA that I interviewed a bit after. Now, when it comes to LBT women in particular, you have sexism, which plays a huge role in their situation. You have to know that gay men are already seen as a niche, like it's sexual orientation, so it's not a lot of claims. But for women, it's just like if they didn't exist. It's a niche among the niche, and they're just non-existent. But what is interesting is that you have at the same time invisibility and hypervisibility of those claimants, and not exactly for the good reasons. You do have sexist violence, which is applied to homosexual women too. One of the rapporteurs at the CNDA told me, but I'm going to quote her here because it's very strong, during advisement, there are scandalous things that happen. It's very subjective. Many things are based on physical appearance. When a woman has been raped, I doubt that a girl like her has been raped, look at her face. So stuff like that is still happening in France right now. But you also have misplaced sexual curiosity for lesbian asylum seekers who are asked what they do, basically, and trans asylum seekers who are just asked to justify who they are and not believed at all. You also have a real lack of specific support and structures. There is no accommodation which is specific for trans people, so they are confronted to violence a lot. And trans and bi persons, well, they have their dossier passed as homosexual by associations because everyone knows that the asylum institutions won't understand what is trans or what is bisexual, so it's better to pass their dossier as a homosexual one. And also you have almost no association for lesbian asylum seekers who are really vulnerable, because when you're accompanied by an association, it really does raise your chances to have the refugee status. What is paradoxical here is that actually LGBT-specific protection that is now resumed to gay men entered French law precisely through women's and lesbians' rights, and through the work of the High Council for Women and Men Equality and for the National Assembly Commission on Women's Rights. So they articulated LGBT rights starting for women, then from women to lesbian women, then bisexual women, and then, why not, sexual orientation in general. And the reform that was passed in 2015 just stated that sexual orientation and gender identity are duly taken into account in the assessment of the asylum claims. We can see that there is a lot of content from the Istanbul Convention. There was no opposition to this specific protection, as I told you, also because it does enter into the vision of asylum in France as, you know, something in the French tradition, something which is part of what Zuber called the Republican civil religion of human rights in France. So it's like a set of beliefs that no one will discuss, and actually you can even see a competition, including among those who are against immigration or those who are against gay rights, in justifying that it's really necessary to protect women and LGBT persons. So this constant reaffirming of the necessity to protect those asylum seekers, even when refusing to vote the amendment, so it's really sometimes paradoxical, has led to the voting of this law on gender sensitivity, which is an important safety net, first, and it is conformed to the Istanbul Convention obligations. More in the process of the law, I would say, than in the content, because the process was really a discussion with feminist associations, reports on specific situation, and then you have to know that it's a safety net because, for example, the general director of the OFPRA is leaving now. He has not been reconducted in his office, also because of the current migration context and the idea that some people would like to have less migrants in France. And, you know, you don't know what will happen to the policies he put into place. But the law is here, so you still have a minimum standard of protection. So protection did happen, thanks to the work of associations and commissions in terms of content, and thanks to the conviction that it was in the French culture, you know, to protect the asylum seekers, which allowed the voting of these amendments. But it's still very fragile. And it is very fragile because you can even say that the 2014-15 asylum law reform is almost a missed opportunity in terms of gender sensitivity. Why missed? And why fragile? Well, because this idea, you know, of universal human rights enter into conflict with other principles that actually also underlie the French approach to asylum, and in particular, like the fear of particularism, of communitarianism, and of specificity and difference in any way. It's a reform that almost failed to include gender at all. You have to know that. Due, I would say, to a tension which is inherent to human rights in France. So you have a very strong and traditional republicanism in France based on the universality of the abstract individual. It's good because it means that everyone deserves human rights, right? But it doesn't mean that you can cater for specificities. So like implementing specific policies and is very difficult, and the question of difference is basically a minefield in political debates. And an illustration of that discomfort is really the pattern of justification for refusing amendments while arguing for the importance of protecting those people, which is kind of surprising. Despite all deputies who agreed on the protection of women and LGBT persons, it was passed in extremis, and all Istanbul Convention references were discarded by the Senate, which is food for thought, I think. It's also a missed opportunity in terms of content, because it's a consensus which is based on the lowest common denominator, saying that sexism and homophobia is bad, but it's not a positive statement, saying we are going to implement those tools. It's just like everyone agrees that it's not good to discriminate, but no one is willing to implement really steps, positive measures, let's say. So it's consistent with the convention, but you have this lack of specific tools, and it's too vague to change really something, above all regarding the delicate question of accommodation. So to conclude very briefly, because I think I'm almost 15 minutes already, but we can discuss it. Okay. Then I will have one more point on the work of association, because I think that it is important. This is also a cultural factor in France, which is very important. You do have a historic strong reliance on the work of associations when it comes to gender and sexuality. And you do have a lot of defiance from associations towards the states. So it's not really creating a dialogue very productive, let's say. And also there is this idea that, sexuality and gender are association stuff. So politicians don't need to vote specific tools for that. So that was something which prevented the voting of specific tools. And to open the debate, I'm talking about Florence Tamagne, because she wrote about homosexuality in the 20th century in France, and she showed that the 20s were more progressive for homosexual people than the 60s or 70s in France, and that this backlash was allowed by the total lack of legal framework. Nothing was voted, so basically the governments could do whatever they wanted to do after that. So this reliance on the work of NGO is good, but then you have to be careful with that, because it can be the open door for backlash. To conclude very quickly, the transposition of gender sensitivity from the Istanbul Convention into national law has given mixed results, let's say. The general principle was favored by some political and cultural factors, so national self-representation as the country of human rights, but its translation into specific tools or policies was prevented by other factors, such as the fear of difference and communitarianism. So overall, it's a safety net, and the situation is more or less conform to Istanbul Convention, but that's thanks to association and asylum institutions, to be honest. But sexist and homophobic violence are unlikely to disappear without an ambitious plan, which leads me to my final point, which is something that some interviewees told me they were doing. It is instead of thinking that LGBT women are too marginal to take into account their specific needs, to start from them, actually. And when you reform asylum law, in this case, to start asking, okay, but is this reform applicable to women, in particular trans women, lesbian women? And if not, maybe trying to revise it, because human rights for all should work for human rights. It should be coherent, consistent with human rights for LGBT women. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. Thank you for keeping the time. May I ask the Alice and Bruno. Poi premi F5 va a schermo pieno.
Good morning. I'm very happy to be here. I'm a PhD student in the School of Psychology at the University of Padua, and this is the study I'm going to present. Let's start with Twitter. Twitter is a social media with 230 million active monthly users in 2013, but nowadays I think they are even more. And differently from the other social media, Twitter is like a online public plaza. In Facebook, you can see the content only if you are a registered user. In Twitter, everybody can see everybody, even the non-registered users. And this is very useful for the research issues, because we have not ethical issues in mining the tweets, because they are already public. The Me Too movement is a movement against sexual harassment and sexual assault, especially in workplace. It's born in 2006 with an hashtag, a slogan of a social activist, Tarana Burke, but it became popular only in 2017 after some story in the show business. Maybe you know about Weinstein, some sexual misconduct, and it became spread worldwide. Me Too movement have a political facets, as Donald Trump, the president of the United States, publicly spoke against the Me Too movement. And also The Economist reported that nowadays most of the Republicans thinks that Me Too gone too far. So the theoretical background of the study is based on two theories. The first one is the system justification theory that states that inequality are stressful for people, so people need to justify inequalities and elaborate justification for these inequalities. And this is useful for people because it is a palliative for the stress of seeing inequalities, but it's also a problem because inequalities are maintained. The second model is the ideology dual model. Conservative ideology is the result of two different worldviews. The first one is the world is dangerous. The second one is the world is a competitive jungle. So this worldview creates some motivation. The first motivation is to maintain stability and security and maintain power against minority. So we have three worldviews. The world is just, the world is danger, and the world is competitive. These worldviews made the Me Too movement a feminist protest, a threat for the conservative worldview. So we have our first hypothesis: the states of the United States, with a higher proportion of conservatives, will have less Me Too tweets on Twitter. Why the frequency of Me Too tweets? I think that the frequency of Me Too tweets can be a good proxy of the interest of the movement in a certain, in a specific area. So where there are more liberal, there is more interest for Me Too, and so there are more tweets about Me Too. I don't care about the sentiment of these tweets, just more interest, more debate. One measure of gender inequality is the Gender Inequality Index. We calculate this measure for United States, maybe for the first time. And this is a measure based on health, difference in health, in economy, and in education between male and females. So my second hypothesis was that where there are more gender inequality by states, there will be less Me Too tweets, for the same reason of the first hypothesis. So I think that if both the variables can explain the frequency of Me Too tweets, we need to see the relation between political orientation and gender inequalities. So the third hypothesis was where there are more conservatives, there will be also more gender inequalities. And then, after the three first simple hypotheses, we can test statistically a wider model to see if this is reliable. Twitter, why use Twitter for a study? Twitter I think it can be seen as a mirror of online reality. And one may think that it is an unreliable mirror, but there are already huge evidence that Twitter can be used for predict reality in a lot of area and with a lot of accuracy, like in personality, in stock market, and so on. In this study, I used I mining thousands of tweets, both from #MeToo hashtag and both from a random sample of all the tweets of United States. So I have a estimation of the use of tweets in all the states, a reliable estimation. I consider only 49 US states because the geocoding program have some problem with Hawaii and Alaska because they are a bit far geographically from the other states. And I use political attitudes from a representative sample of almost 20,000 people. So the first model is based on the prediction of the frequency of #MeToo tweets based on the general use of Twitter, so the general frequency of all the tweets. And obviously, more Twitter used, more will be used also a specific hashtag. And this is the first predictor that is very this explains a lot of the variance of our data. So we have to use a more complex model against this first model. The second model is based on political orientation, and more a state is a conservator, and more and less are the #MeToo tweets. And this difference is reliable. It's very improbable that political does not have an effect. And foresee if the political orientation have a specific effect on #MeToo hashtag. I try a model in which political orientation predicts the general frequency of Twitter, and there's not a relation as expected. So I wanted to see if political orientation was for real a variable that can improve our prediction in the model against just the general use of Twitter. And these statistical tools based on archaic Bayesian statistics shows that political model is better from 8 to 21 times better than the model with only the general use of Twitter, which is a big evidence in favor of the political model. Then I try to run a model with gender inequality. Still, our hypotheses were confirmed. More are gender inequality in a state, and less are the #MeToo tweets. And in this case, I confront the model with political orientation against the model with gender inequality, and the model with gender inequality is a much better predictor of political orientation. It's thousands of times better than that. So political orientation predicts gender inequality. Yes, again, our hypotheses were confirmed, and almost half of the variance of gender inequality by states is explained by the political orientation of that states. So the final model I put all together, and we have a good measure because we have this index like SRMR and CFI that center the gold standards for this kind of measure. So results support our hypothesis. States with more gender inequality produce less #MeToo tweets, and the production of #MeToo tweets by gender explain the 60% of the occurrence. And the political explanation explain almost half of the difference in gender inequality by states. So ideologies in context are really an important predictor of #MeToo, interest in #MeToo. So some potential explanation are that #MeToo highlights word injustice, and #MeToo challenge hierarchies. So #MeToo is viewed as a feminist protest that threat the conservative worldview, as seen in the previous theories. So if you want to improve the goal of Me Too movement, the goal of Me Too movement is to sensitize about sexual violence. We have to consider that the message of Me Too is less present where there's more need of Me Too, because where we have more gender inequalities, we are less message about gender equality. So this is may explained by the fact that the information is biased. People tend to seek and produce information based on previous attitude. So a successful intervention should address this problem of information gathering, and also work on equality in education and health and politics, because if I have more female politicians, I have the opportunity of have more responsibility about the message of inequality and sexual harassment. So the limits of this study are that there is no causal inference, because we now are looking just correlation, tweets, and some indicator. And another big limit are the challenges of big data, because big data like tweets have a very fast creation. The creation of tweets is faster than their analysis, and they are very diverse. Here I just see the frequency, but they are images, they have links, they are video. So have a objective evaluation of these tweets is very difficult. A potential answer is the integration from correlational study with experimental conditions manipulation to see if the hypotheses we explore with correlations are confirmed in a more controlled setting, a more experimental setting. But tweet analysis still have many benefits. Tweet analysis is a powerful tool for studying real collective behavior in real social context, support explorative purpose, is very fast to find, to test hypotheses with Twitter, and you can test for more controlled condition after the first exploration, and may permits the test of theoretical integration between sociological and macro level models and cognitive models with the integration with experimental designs that we'll see soon. Thank you.
Okay, Alice Lucarini is also from the University of Padova with it's a joint project, right?
Yeah.
Hi everybody, thank you University of Trento for welcoming me here. I'm Alice Lucarini, a master student from University of Padova, and I also would like to thank both institutions of Padua and of New York University for having both collaborated to the design of this study. So this study is about Me Too, so before talking about it, I would like to spend a few words on the movement, which, as my colleague said, was born in 2017 in US, with the aim of spreading awareness about the numerosity of episodes of sexual harassment and violence against women. Here you can find an example of article talking about how the phenomenon is growing, mainly on Twitter, and a tweet itself from actress Alyssa Milano, which has been one of the first women and actresses who have strongly supported the movement. So, as I said, Me Too is a movement which was born in US, but it rapidly spread also all around Western society. And since the movement was growing and growing, many women finally found the courage to report sexual harassment, even those which took place several years ago. However, with that, also negative consequences came. In fact, some people started to question the credibility of these women and of the movement itself. Here you can see some article wondering if the Me Too has gone too far and criticizing it. Also some people that normally have always strongly supported women's rights, just like the feminist writer Margaret Atwood, has advanced some criticism against this movement. And here you can see also a picture portraying two people which have been involved in a late reported sexual harassment case in US, and that is the Kavanaugh case, a judge from Supreme Court who has been accused by that woman, Christine Ford, of having sexually harassed her over 20 years ago. And that's interesting, and that's very bad that also President of US, Donald Trump, has strongly criticized Christine Ford and has advanced some doubts about her credibility. So talking about our study, it is born from two questions. First thing we were wondering if is the moment in which a woman reports a sexual harassment, so immediately or late, can affect people's opinion and evaluation about the woman, the perpetrator, and about the event itself. And second, what we wonder is if that really happens, so if there is actually a lack of credibility toward those women who report late, why does that happen? So to answer that, we first have to step back to psychological theory, which has been our main theoretical background in designing this study, and that is the informanization theory from Lyons. Informanization is a psychological process that leads people to perceive members of groups they do not belong to as less defined by human attributes. So informanization measures the perception of humanness perceived in other social targets through a particular paradigm, which is the attribution of secondary emotions. In fact, according to past scientific literature, we can divide emotions in two categories, primary and secondary, where primary emotions are those shared by humans and animals. And some examples are anger, or pain, or excitement. Instead, secondary emotions are those proper only of human beings, and some examples are guilt, shame, humiliation, or remorse. The lack of attribution of secondary emotions can lead to many negative consequences, just like the reduction of empathy, the increase of discrimination, the reduction of helping behaviors, and of guilt. So, what we tried to do was applying this theoretical paradigm to our study, so report that in the context of a late reported sexual harassment case. What we expect is that our participants will show lower levels of responsibility attribution to the perpetrator, but higher level of responsibility attribution toward the victim and to the context when the harassment is reported late instead of immediately. And we also expect that this tendency is gonna be increased when participants tend to attribute less secondary emotions to the victim. Our second set of hypotheses is pretty similar. In fact, we believe that participants will judge the victim of the harassment as less trustworthy when she reports late, and they also will judge the perpetrator as less guilty. And again, we believe that this tendency is gonna be increased by the lower attribution of secondary emotions to the victim. So for our study, we collected a sample of Italian participants of 162 people, and they were exposed to 4 different scenarios describing a sexual harassment against a woman. So in two of these scenarios, the woman, the protagonist, she reported the harassment immediately, but in the other 2, after several years, specifically 7. So those are some examples of our scenarios. And about our variable, the variable we believed are involved in our study, we of course identify our manipulations, so reporting immediately or late as a predictor. but we also measured the attribution of secondary emotion as the political orientation and the sexism of our participants. And we believe that these variables could affect the proportion of victim blaming, the perpetrator's attribution of responsibility, the perpetrator's attribution of guilt, and the trust toward the victim. So, due to time restriction, I won't show you our results concerning political orientation and sexism, but if you have any curiosity about them, I would be happy to show you some graphs at the end of my intervention. About our results, what you can see here, looking at the red bars, is that people tend to attribute more responsibility to the victim and less to the perpetrator when the harassment is reported late. And it's interesting noticing the blue bars that does not happen when the woman reports immediately. It's also interesting looking at the context. In fact, there are no changings according to the experimental manipulation here. So, about the attribution of secondary emotion, what we can see here is that there is a main effect of a lack of attribution of secondary emotions. In fact, reporting immediately or late does not change anything when people tend to attribute less secondary emotions to the victim. So in any case, they will tend to judge the victim as more responsible and also the context, but the perpetrator as less responsible. So to summarize, we pretty much confirmed our first hypothesis, since there is more responsibility attribution to the victim and less to the perpetrator when the harassment is reported late, but there are no changings regarding the context attribution of responsibility. About our second hypothesis, we found here that there are no difference in terms of timing of report, there are no difference regarding when the woman reports the event, but there is a general effect of a lack of attribution of secondary emotions. About our second set of hypotheses, here we can see as we confirmed our second hypothesis, because looking at the red bars, you can see that again, people will judge the victim as less trustworthy and the perpetrator as less guilty when a woman reports late, and that again does not happen when she reports immediately. And about secondary emotion, here what you can see, looking at the left of both graphs of the graph, is that people who tend to attribute less secondary emotions to the victim will also judge her as less trustworthy when she reports late. So that does not happen in the immediately condition, and there are no changings regarding guilt attribution of the perpetrator. So to summarize, again, we confirmed our second hypothesis, and we partially confirmed the other one, since there are changings only in the trust attribution to the victim, but not on the guilt attribution to the perpetrator. What we did at this point was trying to understand our results in a more comprehensive model. So we mainly focused on secondary emotions, and we see that the proportion of secondary emotions attributed to the victim has some direct and non-direct effect on other variables. So you can see that the more people tend to attribute secondary emotions to the victim, the less they will tend to justify what happened. And you can also see that the more people attribute secondary emotions to the victim, the more they trust her, and consequently they tend to justify less what happened. We also found that, as we previously demonstrated, late manipulation plays a role, since the more women report late, the less people trust in them, and consequently they tend to justify more what happened. Late manipulation affects also the proportion of responsibility attributed to the perpetrator. In fact, it becomes lower when women report late, and consequently they tend to justify again less what happened, more what happened. Also, gender plays a role here. So being males implies less proportion of victim trust, and consequently more justification for what happened, and also less responsibility attributed to the perpetrator. So, as a final discussion, when women report late, appeared that people who tend not to attribute secondary emotion to them are not really able to understand how they felt. And this inability make them not able to understand the real reasons why a woman did not report before. And that could lead to some speculation about the reason why she did not do it before. For example, maybe the woman has something to hide, or maybe she was partly responsible for what happened, or maybe it was convenient for her not to report late. And that is something which is very common in the Hollywood show business. So many people address actresses who report late a sexual harassment, the fact that they are looking for visibility. To conclude, what we plan to do now is working on secondary emotions. Since secondary emotions are a construct we can work on through an experimental manipulation. So what we plan to build is an intervention study, training our participants in using more secondary emotion to describe how a woman felt during an harassment. And we would like to check if this training would help people to attribute more responsibility for the event and more guilt to the perpetrator, and also less responsibility toward the woman and more trust to her. So that's basically what we are planning to do now, and we are very excited about that, since we really believe that making people more conscious about how a woman actually feels when she leaves a sexual harassment could really be a helpful tool to spread more consciousness about this phenomenon. I would like to conclude with a sentence from Marion Pichel, which is the following. In the pursuit of human rights and social justice for all persons, gender equality is a foundational part of our journey. And thank you. That's it.
Thank you also for keeping the time. May I, let me give you the room. I'll move myself on this side so we can open discussion. So we can open discussion of this very rich panel that led us through considerations about narratives and how we're immersed deeply within the heteronormativity of narratives, even in spaces that try to be alternative, to the widespread homophobia that prevents the French human rights to actually be experienced as fully human rights and human rights for all. And I think I would like to, during the debate, to ask Amandine whether she can further explore the connection between the cultural field and the legal field. That, of course, I know it's a general and big question, but it is the challenge that we wanted to take up with this conference by asking everybody to focus on the cultural field, of course, in the context of the Convention of Istanbul, even though the last two speakers, Bruno and Alice, took us to another country mostly, but let us keep at least in a comparative perspective the convention that we're trying to address. I think it is important here, again, from a kind of militantly cultural point of view, to understand whether the hashtag only reflects the context or whether it can also change it, modify it. Is it a tool of intervention upon the context or just a good mirror of what the context is? And as for secondary emotions, it seems to me that I could translate that into the culturally constructed emotions, and therefore socially and contextually determined emotions. And that's why the time frame that changes becomes of primary importance. I also hope that the discussion will address this attempt to provide tools for experiencing the emotions of the victim. I think we could open discussion to that. Those of us who were here yesterday know that some of us struggle rather to invite people to experience the emotions of the woman who liberates herself, of the woman who becomes free, rather than experiencing the emotions of the victim. So we have two perspectives here too. I hope I have understood enough to invite the audience to ask questions, make comments, or of course the participants to do the same among themselves. Please.
Yes, I have a question for the last two, or at least the last contribution. It seems to me that this is clearly a scientific perspective that you are embracing. I would like to know a little bit more about the experiment, because it seems to me that these are really experiments that are reproduced into a very aseptic context, since you take into consideration the emotions, as you said, of the victim, and then the time frame. And I also would like to know how much late is late in this case? Is late 20 minutes late or 3 years late? I mean, I think this time has a lot of makes a lot of difference, but also the fact that this looks as an experiment to me. So the question is, we also know that there are power relations. So I was wondering if you also considered the question of power, or is this just a scientific experiment in a vacuum space?
Okay, so you're right. So being an experiment, it took place on Qualtrics, which is an online platform for surveys. However, we tried to make it as more personal as possible, building in a very specific way our scenarios in order to involve our participants in the story. So making them with many details. What we were hoping was that our participants would be involved, and then they would be able to think about how maybe the woman was feeling or not, since as we saw many participants, they did not do that. So that's how we try to come across the limit of doing it online. And about reporting late, it was after 7 years in our scenarios that those women were reporting the harassment. So I would say a long time. And so to show that to our participants, what we said was presenting the scenarios, and in the end saying our scenarios was like a paper in a journal, so just like an article. So our participants were exposed to the story, which took the woman's point of view, and in the end, the author of the article said that the woman was reporting the harassment after 7 years. So you then asked me something about power, and what I can say is that we tried to consider this variable in our study, since, as I said, we built 4 different scenarios, and in those scenarios we manipulated the relationship of power between the woman and between the perpetrator. So I had no time to show you those data, unfortunately, since I only had 15 minutes, but what we found out analyzing them was that the more power distance there was between the woman and the perpetrator, the more our participants tend to judge as more heavy the situation, so as more problematic. And regardless of the fact that the woman was reporting late or not. So for example, in a scenario which has been judged as the more severe, there was student, a university student, and a professor, and he was asking her to have sex in order to obtain a maximum grade at his exams. In the scenarios with lower severity, instead, there was described a case of sexual harassment between 2 friends. So, of course, we try to manipulate power relationship against them. And I hope I've answered to all your doubts, but if you have any other doubts, please feel free to ask me.
Other questions?
Thank you for your contribution. I'm Federica. Okay, I talk with with you because it's something similar of the previous question, but with some other details. Because I'm finishing the qualitative research on sexual harassment in university. I was asking you if you could control during your experiment the opinion from people sharing male and female opinion, because this victim trust or blame, victiming, and the fact that the victim often is not believed, even from familiar, parents, partner, for example, and this is one of the reasons because they do not report this. So the first question is, have you control in some way the gender of the opinion? Okay, because it's interesting, because unfortunately there are a lot of women that have some judge in front of these cases, and the time 7 years, maybe I didn't understand properly about this, how to decide this type of time, because I think that for the psychological process also, when you are living and you are completely inside sexual harassment, it's very difficult to give that name, and maybe it starts to be possible time by time, sometimes after 5 years, sometimes after 7, sometimes after 10, 20 years. And so I'm curious to know about why 7. And if you control a range, some range, for example. So it could be interesting what is happening after, I don't know, 3 from 7, 7 from 10, 10 from 12, something like this. Thank you.
So thank you for your questions first, and to answer to the first one about gender. So I did not report in my graphs gender difference because there were no gender difference. So both males and females had this tendency in attributing less secondary emotions to a woman who has been sexually harassed. So that's why we did not report that, unfortunately. And so about the opinions of our participants, of course, this is a quantitative research, but we thought that it was important to let them, at the end of the survey, to have the possibility of write something about the reasons why a woman didn't report immediately. And so that's what we did. However, those are really fresh data, so we are still work in progress with the analysis of this last part, which is longer. Basically, we can just put it on a software. So it's gonna take time, but we collected this data and we plan to work also on them. And I think it's gonna be interesting. And also hearing feedbacks from my participants, what I heard was that they really appreciated the fact that they could have a space at the end of the survey to fill in with their personal opinion. So that was useful. And about the decision, about time framing. So what we did was basically doing a focus group with the other collaborators to the study, and together we discussed it about which time framing was better to use. So at first I proposed 5 years, but then many people involved in this project, as you see their names are at the start of my presentation, they told me that maybe 5 years weren't enough. So through discussion altogether, we decided to use 7 years. And about the last part of your second question, so we focused on only one episode of sexual harassment, which is pretty intense, because often in the first scenarios, the perpetrator tries to have sex with the woman. So it's not something which is through the time, but it's just one episode, a specific one. But I understand that maybe it's hard to get it since I couldn't show you the scenarios in detail. But thank you for your questions.
Okay. Oh, yes.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for putting together this panel, because it really shows us the strength of interdisciplinary approach, different approaches methodologically and from different disciplines, the experimental, the big data, more thought, interviews. So I really appreciate the diversity of this panel. And in relation to that, there is a fil rouge, which is about somehow collective action and how it is perceived, so the space, how it is conceived, and the institution, how they manage and they interact with associations, and then how people tweet collectively. So spread awareness through collective action, and then the reaction of the perceiver to those stories and collective action outcomes. So I was thinking, do you believe that maybe this Me Too movement, going back to the initial presentations, may also find a specific space for the minority of LGBT, or a longer acronym? I want to include everybody, so add all the letters you want. And if so, do you think it would be a good or a negative idea to have a Me Too that is specific for this minority, so an online space? Or maybe not, as you were claiming that is not so obvious. So it was kind of bridging.
About the Me Too movement, so I've been in LGBT associations at the moment of the Me Too movement in general. I think it was a very interesting time, because LGBT associations were not directly involved with the Me Too movement, although they did show support for the youngest one generally. I think it is interesting because it underlines something that I tried to show also in my presentation, which is that this LGBT movement is very often dominated by men. And in particular in older associations, you had no interest for the Me Too movement. It was more in the youngest one, where you had more women, especially lesbian and bisexual women, and trans people too, would then get involved. And I saw quite a high frustration from those youngest generation, underlining that they had the feeling as women mostly that they were not listened to even by other by people who were supposed to be in their community. So I think it was an interesting way of questioning what is a community and who makes a community, let's say. So for me, I would say that the Me Too movement, I would really appreciate if it was, keeping the target on sexual harassment, including on gay men, etc. But let's be honest, it's more about women in general, because it is also an interesting way to question power relations, including in subcultures that are supposed, to be more open, let's say. For asylum seekers, I mean, it wasn't really relevant for LGBT asylum seekers because I may be a bit harsh, but they have all lived a rape, minimum, generally. So, it was I think it wasn't really relevant to their situation because it was so spread that,
So then concerning safe spaces I would say that there were actually, or it's interesting that there were LGBT people who also reported under the hashtag of #MeToo, but from how I understood it and how it was covered in the media, they were predominantly gay men or men who were harassed by other men. So there was a gender bias in this and also a sexuality bias. And I would say that this also supports the notion that women, and especially people perceived as women, and especially homosexual homosexual women, are often narrated as non-sexual in a certain way, and that they kind of were not very visible in this movement. And I think with it, the safe spaces and these hashtags, they are two different things, because the idea of safe spaces is to have something that is separate from everything else. So a hashtag would be very open, and I would say that if you try to give publicity to something, for example to new modes of living together that are practiced in safe spaces, you always need to take the current mainstream context where you're gonna project it on. And in a moment where a mainstream society is very narrating women as chaste or as hypersexual, it's difficult for certain locations to make harassment public, because it's the problems that we already saw in more heterosexual settings, they're gonna be even stronger, and then I think the benefit for people who are speaking out will be less than the rejection and the kind of projected traumas they are getting. So I think it needs to be seen in context in a certain way.
Well, thank you for stressing the need to put things in context. It's probably an old lady remark, but the time frame that is so abstract, 7 years, it seems to me has a little problem. Time comes with space. And 7 years may be a very long time or a very short time. What really matters is when our culture has given us the tools to break the silence about sexual harassment. That's when you can report it. It could be 2 weeks ago or 50 years ago, but the abstract 7 years out of place, as I said, it's probably my own limitations, but makes me more uncomfortable with the aseptic model of inquiry rather than the but I'm a person in literature, so I declare my own limitations, rather than with the narrative exploration of the complexity of these realities. But I thank you all. In any case, it was a very nice panel, especially with these two sides. I enjoyed it. And it is time for a coffee break. Let's come back exactly at 11 so that we continue with our schedule. Thank you.
Okay, we have to restart. I have the pleasure to chair this section, and I'm very pleased to Giovanna to have organized this panel with also young generation of researchers, because it's very much interesting to see how issues we have discussed in the past have been reactualized. And also one of the key issues I wanted just to stress in the previous panels is what does it mean to denounce? To denounce in not only in political and legal terms, but also in cultural terms. So that victims or survivors, because nowadays they use mainly the word survivors, denounce their experience after many years, what are their emotions just in feeling free. But also we saw also in the last panels also the different issue was who is entitled to have rights and who lost rights. And so powerful women who denounce in Hollywood the double discrimination at work, because actresses get less money than men for the same job, as it happens in normal life, and then also related to domestic abuses. So I think that Me Too was a radicalization of women's movement, and between harassment in terms of just for jobs and work, and also sexual violence. So I think that is still a revolution, Me Too movement. And the other side, refugees or minorities who have a problem just in let recognize their rights. So it's very important just to stress the issue of denounce also in terms of research, social justice and human rights. So we should restart now. Unfortunately, we have to say that we are very, very sorry that some researchers couldn't come from Russia and also from other countries and India, because of the difficulty to get visa. So unfortunately, also the research is not free, does not have free borders because of restriction of visa, and we are very sorry about that, because we believe that teaching and research should be free and borderless, and we have to struggle also about that. So now it's a pleasure to introduce three researchers. Cristina Aguilera from the University of Bristol, and we met during the last conferences related to Renate's network, and then Federica Anastasia of the University of Trieste, and Ignacio Rodriguez from the University of Murcia in Spain. Do you in order, or do you prefer okay? In order? Yeah. So the floor is to Mela Aguilera. The topic of her speech is When Culture Matters, Discourses Shaping Institutional Responses to Gender-Based Violence in Chile. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And yes, in my presentation, I'm gonna give you a picture in the minutes I have available about the situation of how institutional responses have been developed in tackling gender-based violence in Chile, the case of Chile, where I come from, but also an overview about, in general, Latin America, which is the region that... and so the state of the art in these responses, tackling gender inequality and gender-based violence, and as I said, the case of Chile as a case study, and stressing particularly the role of cultural constructions as discourses shaping these responses, and how these cultural constructions are related to gender roles, gender identity, which are very clear in Latin America and are getting on the way in these institutional responses, as we will see. To explain a bit how I came with this idea is because my PhD study, which I did in the University of Bristol, is based on research I conducted about the construction of gender in professional discourses in child protection services in Chile, with 3 teams in a region in Chile, and I was interested in looking at how professional interventions with families, with children and families, were shaped by these discourses, and how the professional narratives were shaped not only by this cultural construction as socially constructed discourses, but also there were institutional discourses that are related to the framework for practice, the policy guidelines, and it's something that I will look in more detail now. Especially, I found a very strong link between these professional practices, these interventions, and these institutional discourses, but these institutional discourses link with these cultural constructions. And to explain a bit and how I relate this presentation to the context of this conference here, that you are discussing the Istanbul Convention and how culture is a gender-based violence, a cultural issue that is to be tackled with the Istanbul Convention, I have to tell you that in Latin America, we started this journey in tackling gender-based violence long ago, and we were kind of an experiment that way, and that the women's rights were inscribed in the region within what was the general struggles for human rights, because, as you know, in Latin America we faced, most of countries in Latin America faced dictatorships. The case of Brazil, the case of Peru, the case of Chile, Argentina, Uruguay during the 70s. And in the case of Chile, the dictatorship lasted 17 years, from 1973 to we recovered democracy in 1990. And then the struggles for women's rights was inscribed and emerged in the concept of the struggle for human rights, because the feminist movement played a key role in fighting against the dictatorship, and then they posed the issue of women's rights within that. So that was a driving force, but at the same time, as we recovered democracy, we entered this area of these international agreements coming from the UN, the Council of Europe, certainly, and one specific instrument was the CEDAW and the Declaration of the Elimination of Violence Against Women, 1993, which led to the specific convention that we have, the specific instrument that we have in Latin America, that is the Inter-American Belém do Pará Convention on the prevention, punishment, and eradication of violence against women. That is our kind of Istanbul Convention, but in the context of Latin America. So as you can see, we started this journey some years ago, and this has been shaping the institutional responses, government responses across Latin America in tackling gender-based violence. And the main outcomes out of the institutionalization of the gender agenda in the region is what is known the gender mainstreaming paradigm, which is coming from the Beijing, the platform for action coming out of the Beijing conference. And it is aimed at addressing gender inequality that should be reflected in policies and public services, in reflecting on these gender inequalities and making visible these inequalities in addressing them. And in terms of that, across Latin American countries, there have been put in place legal frameworks to sanction, for example, violence against women. And across the positive outcomes, we have an increasing awareness of women's rights as citizens, and some recognition of sexist attitude, but still not enough, I will say, and I will talk about that, because this progress we have made with legislation and changing some attitudes, it is constrained by the cultural aspect that is shaped by our history of being shaped by Catholic family values, because that is the legacy of colonization that to the region, the Catholic discourse was brought by the Spanish conquest, and we are, in Chile, we are a Catholic country, and across the region, Latin American countries are all Catholic, and that is shaping this cultural aspect of how we deal with violence against women. And the issue of cultural construction is really reflected in conceptualizations of gender equity, how these institutional responses are shaped by these socially constructed discourses, and particularly about gender norms and gender identity. We have these concepts, machismo, or machismo in English, is very well known in Latin America, and Latin America in general has been depicted as this macho culture, which the other side is Marianismo, which is a term coined by the Stevens in 1973 to reflect on the issue that machismo or machismo has this other side, that is Marianismo, which is a concept that reflects on this gender female identity as shaped by the ideal model of the Virgin Mary. And that's the Catholic discourse shaping gender identity, that women should behave in a way that is sacralized, that is a good mother, self-sacrifice, the purity, and that is leading to a strong maternalism that has been recognized a strong feature in Latin America, that women are seen as destined to be mothers, that the destiny for a woman is to be a mother. So the responses to gender equality and in general violence against women, although some progress have been made, as I said, with specific legislations across the countries, and in the case of Chile, limitations are related to this conceptualization of gender roles, and especially female identity, as inscribed within the notion of family values, that women have a very particular place within the family. So when, for example, legislation about gender-based violence, violence against women is inscribed within the notion of intra-family violence. And as we discussed yesterday, we have to name things, and the way we name things has implication in how we, in our conceptualizations, in our approaches. And the concept of intrafamily violence has been discussed as something shaping institutional responses. And although some progress has been made, some backlash is also on the way. For example, we have made progress with the introduction of the crime of femicide, which is something that started in 2007. And in Chile, we started in 2011, based on Russell conceptualization of femicide. But we face the issue that legal definitions vary from one country to another and tend to be very narrow. And for example, Lagarde, a Mexican feminist scholar, have introduced the concept of feminicide to make clear that it's not only the perpetrator's responsibility of killing women because of their gender, but also there is a state's complicity in not acknowledging clearly this violence and in perpetuating this violence by supporting the normalization of violence against women. So that's an interesting development. And in terms of outcomes, Latin American feminists have consistently pointed out the complicity of the state through their failings in addressing these issues. For example, not taking seriously women's reports of domestic violence, the judiciary narrow framings, which leads to women's not being willing to speak about this violence because they go on and on to the police and they are not taken seriously, so they see there's no good outcomes out of that. And particularly the normalization of gender-based violence through these socially constructed discourses, as I said, related to these gender norms. And we also face the issue of lack of accurate statistics, resources, training, due to the constraints and resources. And now, at the moment that there has been some progress, at the same time, there is this backlash against gender awareness, trying to invoke this gender ideology narrative with some conservative groups, right-wing politicians, conservative groups associated with the Catholic Church, claiming that this gender ideology narrative is destroying the family. So there is a strong backlash. We also have the issue of indigenous people, something that was addressed by Renate Klein with a presentation yesterday, but I don't have to address that, which is a complex issue. But this idea of how the concept of gender that is brought with these international agreements, these international agencies operate in Latin America, sometimes get in clash with local notions of how is gender understood and gender relations in the indigenous worldview. And the problem of essentialism in Latin America is very clear because of these socially constructed roles and the tensions that come from that. And something that is clear, this legislation alone does not change the culture when we have these pervasive assumptions. And however, it is very positive that the key role of some advocates in the Chilean, for example, network of feminist group, the Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, they have a campaign that started in 2007, which is Caution Machismo Kills, which is a very strong campaign in the press. They make demonstration, increasing awareness, and it has very effective in engaging more people, the civil society, to denounce the failings of the state. And another issue is the emergent student feminist movement that took place only last year and followed the Me Too movement and started with some students in the universities denouncing the sexual harassment by people in power, by lecturers, professors, and after that, many universities have started to set up protocols to deal with sexual harassment, which is which is something very positive, and that the lessons to take from that is that the key role of social and feminist movement in demanding responses to the state and continuously being monitoring the state responses, institutional responses to prevent the bureaucratization, and also the educative work that this implies. And as something that was addressed yesterday with Renee's presentation, legislation and measures, institutional measures, needs to go in hand with this civil society movement to increase awareness and demand the state to do their job.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have different topics because now I give the floor to Anastasia, University about the custody of children in difficult separations. They have touch of social workers.
No, I just changed. Okay, just a moment. Okay, yeah. Okay. Yeah, but for me. Okay, hi to everybody, and it's my pleasure to be here. Okay, the custody of children in difficult separations, task of social workers. And then, okay, I will explain much better what I mean with difficult separations. I'd like to introduce my contribution with some specific name from the Istanbul Convention, because I think that the first of all important things is to name. Okay, and I've clear that, for example, for violence against women, we mean a violation of human rights, like Istanbul Convention says, and the form of discrimination against women, and shall mean all acts of gender-based violence that result in or are likely to result in physical, sexual, psychological, or economic harm or suffering to women, including threats of such acts, coercion, or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or private life. I can show you domestic violence and the meaning of gender as social constructed roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes that a given society consider appropriate for women and men. So I would like to make you think today and the day after, and for all people around you, about what you mean for gender and for violence against women, from the young generation to the whole people, because it's a transversal and cross-sectional problem, because sometimes even for a too much number of messages and calls all around the day is connected to violence, but we don't think too much. So I would like to pass an input to pay attention, to be awareness and consciousness for us and for people around us. Specifically, gender-based violence against women is the violence that is directed against a woman because she is a woman, or that affects women disproportionately. We have to remember this because sometimes there are a lot of misunderstandings about these concepts. Okay, just few data from different studies. Okay, in Europe, 1 in 3 women experience intimate partner violence during their lifetime, according to the survey FRA 2014. And so we can count us today, for example, 1 in 3. Witnessed violence is the child experiencing directly or indirectly domestic violence on reference figures. This definition is from Chismai, 2017. And really, okay, this is just a really fast introduction. And we have to remember that in the 65% of cases of IPV, there is witnessed violence, and in the 25% of these cases, children are directly involved. 65%. And we have to remember that the post-separation time is a risk of continuation or even increase of violence. It's not a time that can make feel a woman safe. No, it's the opposite, the immediately post-separation time. Okay, I wanna give just I wanna just spend few words talking about strategies and tactics to conceal violence against women. Okay, Professor Romito and then another Zocio Bandura go deeply inside this topic because identify and confront the violence against women require radical action and change in our societies. Strategies and tactics are some ways that people use less and more consciousness, to make the violence continue, to let it be about violence. Strategies are something more about a concept, and tactics are the tools that can go into reality and make it be. Okay, for example, like legitimation, negation. That means do not consider, do not see and make a sense to the perception and to the action about violence, and let it be like natural, okay, like possible and like acceptable. Tactics involve different type of tactics and way, like, for example, euphemizing, that means to not give the correct name to the things. Just an example, if I call conflict and not violence, I can use a family mediation, for example, and this is a big change in the life of a person. For example, the humanizing, you talked before, is like do not consider a person like a person, but like an object. So if I use this, I do this, is an object, doesn't feel nothing. But a perpetrator do the same thing with a woman, that is a person, or with the children is the same. Blaming the victim, psychologizing is a very dangerous thing because it involves to use some psychological theories to blame the victim and legitimize the violence, for example, naturalizing, and separating. That means to consider one person like two. For example, we have a violent man, a violent partner, and usually he is considered a very good and amazing father. Like two persons, but the person is the same. And we know, and a lot of studies highlighted this, that a violent partner in almost the 10% of cases is a violent father, directly or indirectly. The context of my research is about custody children with this type of law in Italy, the 54 and the 154. The principle of co-parenting introduced by from this law, the difficult separation that almost in the 10% of cases involve domestic violence, the so-called parental alienation syndrome, family mediation, social workers and their key role in this type of context, and about their hard task of protection of children and take an action against violence. In a context of patriarchal culture and a lot of prejudices. So I wanna think about where is the best interest of the child. I will be really fast. This is the most principal article I took now for today. Just for remember that Istanbul Convention give us a lot of instruments, a lot of tools to follow and to help us to take some decision. For example, to place the right of the victim in the center, to promote the change in a social and cultural partners or behavior, to put the protection support for children at the first place, to really take the correct measures to ensure the right of children during the visitation, for example, and to prohibit mandatory alternative dispute resolution processes, including mediation or conciliation when there is just a suspect of violence. The aim of this study is to explore the dynamics of social workers' practice regarding the custody of children in so-called difficult separation, to analyze, acknowledge the opinions, the practices, the prejudices of the social worker who work in this specific situation, and to explore the use of strategies and tactics to conceal violence in the speech of social workers. It was a qualitative, explorative research that let we go deeply in the phenomenon. This is the procedure, so interviewed and then transcribed. It involves a sample of 15 social workers with 1 male and 14 female, with the average age of 40 years and the average work experience of 14 years. A semi-structured interview, recorded and transcribed. Everything according to the University Code of Ethics. I go so fast. The results. The results highlighted some categories that we previous considered and another one that we did not consider previous. I think that it's much better if I read this part of transcription that I think can talk. What we found? We found a forced fathering. This is a social worker The child did not want to see dad, and she does not want to. My question, in your opinion, why do you push the child to see the father even if the child does not want to? Because there is a right of the child. However, when the child is small, she does not yet know how much. So this is a big problem because the right of the children becomes the right of parent. And this is an important point underlined even from the International Convention of the Rights of Child. We are talking about 1989, so before Istanbul Convention in these cases. Mediation as a rule, and the consequences is an abuse of family mediation. For example, in this case, because all cases should go the transition with the mediation. We have to remember that the Istanbul Convention prohibits the use of mediation in case of violence. There is a really confusion between conflict and violence. In a highly conflict situation, she was hit hardly. Conflict. Another one. They were fighting. There was a quarrel. The child told us. The father took a knife and threw it on the mother, and the child protected his mother, and the knife arrived on his hand, so he has a scar on his hand. Mom took a lot of beatings, and this time the knife. This is called quarrel. A knife. Okay. Violence is not symmetrical. Conflict, yes. A quarrel, yes. Blaming of the mother. Okay. You should think, the social worker addressing the mother, of the damage you do to your child. Because children love their parents, even if they are... When a child says, my father sucks, most of the time it's because he's manipulated by his mother. And we can open a long of time discourse about so-called parental alienation syndrome that has no scientific basis, that is used a lot between lawyers, between psychologists, between social workers, that use it in their relationships, in relationships, and take decision considering something that is not real and not exist. Okay. Another, women and children are not believed, as a rule. The woman reports him for the sexual abuse on the child. The child tells her that at the night, the father goes into the room, touches her private parts, tells her, do not say anything to your mother. So, of course, we never believed. Partly because we know him, partly because the things he tells are so absurd. I want to really underline, of course, we never believed. And I cannot really tell you that it's not one case. It was, as rule, this type of approach. So why we, of course, never believe? Okay. So this make we think about the poor knowledge of violence. 60-70% of child sexual abuse are intrafamiliar abuse. We are talking before about intrafamiliar violence, and we have to remember that the first complaint of child sexual abuse are estimated between 2 to 8%, and in this 2 to 8%, the almost 10% of cases are by the father, not by the mother. This is the study's evidence. Mediation at the service of violent father. Mediation is like a great tool for working on parenting and safeguarding the father figure. So the Istanbul Convention is completely unknown, and so is not applied. Only one social worker. Mediation. I had to come across the harsh reality. Mediation needs certain characteristics in situations of sexual abuse, violence, or mistreatment. These are all conditions in which couples are not mediated. A difference in level of power within a couple. Only one social worker. This is the category I didn't consider previously. Okay, the social workers' working conditions. This is one, but it was common between the sample. I received that trees, they refer to violent partners, are extremely heavy to handle. I think I have rooted them in DNA now. So, once a dad showed up with a bullet, he showed it to me and he said, now I have to decide if it's for me or for you. So I wanna really highlight the condition, the street, the trees, the strat, the isolation, the no possibility to elaborate their professional situation, and how this mean, okay, I do discontinue, that it's difficult to give a name if I allow this to me. So, social services and social worker practice, we have seen the lack of knowledge and the prejudices, the patriarchal culture, the scarce recognition and activation about concealment of violence and against women, and decisions and practices harmful for women and children. So Istanbul Convention is not applied, unknown, ignorant. If the protection of children involves the interruption of violence against them and mother. So it's necessary a cultural change. Commitment, passion are not enough. It's necessary specific training, and this is the way to improve knowledge, awareness, and change. Because only by bringing to light what is there, we can intervene, change, improve, and operate from the perspective of justice and well-being. I leave you with this phrase of Professor Romito that I think it could be a great input to use our emotional part and even the reason, not only the illusion, but the reason. I let you read because my time, I think, is gone. Okay.
Okay, thank you
Sorry.
very much. Now, your presentation, Ignacio Rodriguez, double Rodriguez. Yep. Okay, okay, about gender-based violence and cyberspace. That is, okay, could you pass?
Okay, we shift.
Yes.
It's much better.
I move to there.
Yeah. Okay.
Difficult.
Okay. Is there if this one? To drink, to
Yes, I need to drink prior to speaking. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you for the University of Trento. And well, I am Ignacio Rodriguez. I am from the University of Alicante and also from the University of Murcia, because I am finishing a PhD in computer science in Murcia and beginning a PhD in gender studies in Alicante. So that's the reason we are in the middle of two universities. So we're gonna talk about cyberspace. What is this? What is this concept? Well, in this world, we are all the time interacting using internet, using computer networks, and of course, in this environment, we need to use information and communication technologies, ICT. Please, no novel technologies. Since we are in 2019, it's not a novelty, you know. So ICT, in this emerging society, creating, manipulating, and distributing information set constraints to social, cultural, and economic activities. And with this, we have some risks, and of course, we have some opportunities. And talking about the risks of these knowledge systems, we have the gender digital gap, we have a lack of privacy, we have an underestimation of the danger of ICT, and of course we have new ways to perform violence. But on the other hand, we have also some opportunity to reduce the gender digital gap using education, to make new laws for this new environment, and to promote cyber support to victims and to use technological advances. Firstly, we need to set the frame. And talking about the Istanbul Convention, in Article 17, it emphasizes that parties shall encourage the private sector and especially the ICT sector to participate in policies to prevent violence against women. Well, I think this is only an article, but I think in this field we can develop a lot of strategies to fight against digital gender-based violence. First, talking about the gender-digital gap, it refers to the difference between women and men in resources and facilities, capabilities and usefulness to access and effectively utilize information and communication technologies. We've got 3 different gaps, and the first is the lack of resources, the lack of facilities, the lack of devices. If we don't have a computer, if we don't have a smartphone, it's over. We cannot access to the internet. The second one is the education, is the knowledge to how to use those devices. And the third one is the utility of the resources. Maybe we have a lot of information, but it is not useful to us. So this is the third gap. So gender digital gap is another phase of poverty. And of course, it introduces weaknesses in health information, in education, and economic growth. Talking about gender digital gap and talking about women as users, this is just an example. In Forocoches, which is the biggest forum on the internet in Spanish, we can find 300,000, more than 300,000 active accounts, but more or less only 20,000 are of female users. So this leads to female users are often suffering sexist replies. And continuing with the gender digital gap, and talking about women as professional, there is a phenomenon called leaking STEM pipeline, which is STEM is the word of science, technology, engineering, and maths studies or disciplines or whatever. And the higher is the education, the lower is the percentage of presence of women. Which are the causes? Of course, education, gender and sex roles, economical reasons, feminization of poverty, and a lower participation in decision-making of women. So that's the importance of empowerment of women, because if men are the ones who are taking the decision, of course, they will focus on male interest. So continuing, how to fight gender digital gap. So in example, in Spain, at the Women Institute, Instituto de la Mujer, we have some programs like program Atenea to improve self-confidence in ICT, program REA to promote female entrepreneurship using ICT, and others like Diana and Ada to promote STEM studies between girls and women. Continuing, what is the digital violence? Well, it's one of the expressions of gender violence, but developed in a cyber environment. So, for instance, in the field or in a couple, the intimate partner could develop this digital gender-based violence, for instance, controlling the mobile phone, interfering in relationship with other people, spying the smartphone, and others, for instance, like demand location. And this is more or less it's more usual between teenagers. Send me your location. Where are you? I don't trust you. So send me your location. To demand sexual images and ask for passwords, and many of them. This is maybe the first steps of gender-based violence. And in further steps, we can talk about digital criminal offenses like cyberstalking, which is stalking using electronic means. Cyberbullying, more or less, is the same idea, and in the teenagers is more usual. Grooming, when an adult abuse of children because they gain their trust using social networks. Sextortion, coercion, using some sexual images, things like that. Doxing, we will talk about this later, and of course, phishing and hacking. What can we do with this new criminal offenses? We have to adapt laws. So signatory countries need to develop new laws to face this new situation. And we have 3 strategies to do that. The first one is to create new articles or new laws, new article in existing laws. The next is to rewrite some existing articles. And the third is to make a new interpretation of existing law without changing them. So in Spanish criminal code, in Spain, the criminal code was amended by this organic law in 2015. And for instance, sextortion was managed with a new article, the article 197.7, and this new article says that it is punishable to distribute images or recordings obtained with consent, even with consent. We cannot distribute something that someone has sent to us in a private environment. Continuously stalking, the article 172 has been rewritten, and it was completed specifying that it is stalking using any way of communication, including social network. Other criminal offenses like cyberbullying has been treated only with a reinterpretation of existing articles, and the same with grooming. Doxing is not by now a criminal offense. But of course, we are really close to that. This is just to publish public information about someone to the internet. And that is public information that could be embarrassing in other contexts, personally revealing, or something that the victim would just rather keep to themselves or in another area of their lives. For instance, something about the sexual orientation, sometimes it is broadcast in another context. What can we do with that? Of course, we have to improve awareness to proper manage contents. We have to improve the education in cybersecurity. We have to manage properly social relationships. And in the case of underage users, they have to be supervised by progenitors. We have to promote healthy relationships. Of course, we don't have to fall in demonization of ICT. Continually, we have to do this even with digital natives, with people who have born and are used to be in this new environment, a digital environment, because maybe they don't know exactly the dangers that are facing. We have to take advantage of the technologies and to support victims with that. For instance, using technological support, using secure bands equipped with GPS to know where is a criminal and abuser, and if the criminal is near to the victim, there is an alarm and police is warning. Sadly and unfortunately, this technology is not working really fine because by now those secure bands are obsolete in Spain, And they are using 2G and 3G signals and not 4G, and they are sometimes causing false alarms. Assistants complain about the low lapse of time they have to manage a situation. Continually, we have to talk about the technical assessment. In a court, it could be determining to, in a case of gender-based violence, and computer forensic professional needs to be awareness and maintains a gender perspective. They have to properly custody the proofs and have a duty of confidentiality. These are the results of a study done 3 months ago, more or less, in the universities in Spain. I asked to the universities if they are using their technological resources to support gender-based violence. And of course they are not. But I think it is something crazy, because universities, and of course my university and University of Trento, I'm sure they have a lot of people working in computer science. So why don't we use that to assist to victims? And we have asked if they have some kind of identification of harassment situation in social networks, and they haven't. If they have specific programs for detection and treating severe stalking, no. Professional computer support, or many others, or specific mobile applications, and they haven't. I think we have to improve this, and we have to take advantage of these technological resources. We've got some apps. This is another resource we can use. For instance, Libre, Pillada por Ti, Relación Sana in Murcia, in my city. These apps are for educate. It's just to educate. And we have another one, Biomap, and in using this app, victims can locate the exact point of a situation of abuse. So we can know which are the more conflictive areas. And that's all. I have to thank to the Instituto Universitario of Investigación de Estudio de Género de la Universidad de Alicante for funding and supporting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we see that also from different disciplines, point of view, research expertise, the struggle against gender-based violence is a matter of culture. And we've seen from different culture, I mean, from new technologies, from intergenerational perspective, from also different, so to say, not Western country, but also Latin American countries. So again, is a topic of this conference, and also from different point of view, we have to focus also our debate on the fact that gender-based violence is a matter, is a cultural matter. And so I would like to raise questions to all three presentation, or just one intervention, step by step. So I start, so that's then other question. First question, you are from Chile, but we're living in Bristol in the UK. Yeah. But in your presentation, you talk about different experiences in Latin America, but we have not to forget that you have also the Penal Court of Inter-American Court. So my question is this, because you had, after Pinochet, you had also a president of a republic who was a woman, Bachelet. But we see that still in America there is women's movement, like in Argentina, where it was born Non Una de Meno, but also there is a Plaza de Mayo with Carlotto. And so there is always this tension between post-dictatorial policies and women's movement, but we have a new also, so to say, tendencies, or neo-fascist tendency, like in Brazil, because I worked with women from Amazonia And so there is an issue about native women and human rights. But my question is related also to Chile, and mainly what is the specificity of Chile? Because we see that other countries like Ecuador, the abortion is really very much prohibited. And there was a the trial about a woman who was in prison because they said also she was raped in the family, she was condemned to prison, and now she's released. So what is the specificity of Chile? Because it was not clear in your presentation. May I put all three questions so that then we can... About the issue of intergenerational and the issue of social workers, because I'm working with not only social workers but with students in social service, so that there is a matter of training. But I think that when we have to say what is the best interest of the child, it's a matter of decision making too, but in an holistic way. Because when we have to see what is the best interest of the child, we have to have a differentiation between whether it's witness child, and also she has the same, so to say, consequences, like a child who had an abused post-traumatic syndrome, or an abused child, and so in this case a Tribunale dei Minori. So in your presentation you have to also to make differences. Also then is a matter of decision making. Who takes decision making when you have judges, social psychologists, social worker, and and so on. Your question is about the how to use media, and here you have also an intergenerational issue, because we have the use of social media in couples of adults, where we have freedom to us to have a new relationship, but also an increasing of jealousy, what was the result of the thesis of my students. And the other side, you have also the issue of minors and cyberbullying and so on. So a new kind of aggressive, violent education. But there is another point that you did not mention, and is what also a group of Italian former victims or survivors does. That is to use the internet, the web, just as a matter of mutual aid between four former victims, so that they understand each other, whether they were real victims, and is an internet called narcisista patologico, pathology narcissist, where they start to help each other through, they were all over Italy, helping also in tribunal, in trial, and it's very, very much powerful. So it was so I helped also the constitution of a group of mutual self-mutual help. And this is also a very important thing, that is not we have to help, but how they could help using also the internet. Thank you. If you want to answer, yeah. Otherwise...
Okay, I'm going to start then with the first question about the particular situation of Chile in the context of Latin America. Yes, we have a very particular situation there, because as I tried to explain in the presentation, we have followed these international agreements, international agencies, UA, the Council of Europe, have push this gender agenda across Latin America. And in Chile, the situation is that although we have addressed the issue of gender equality, women's rights through this, the introduction of legislation combating domestic violence and all that, but there is, and the feminist movement has a history of some moments of being strong, particularly in the dictatorship, but the issue is this tension between a movement towards increasing gender awareness, increasing gender equality, but at the same time a force contrary to that is very related to Chile being a conservative society, which is basically related to the Catholic discourse, I will say. Well, the dictatorship played a key role as well, because there is a military culture in Chile, And in general, we are shaped by conservative values, that the role of the family and the role of women within that as mothers. So there is a continuous tension, and now with the new student, the feminist student movement, there is a strong movement towards gaining more right. For example, what is being contentious lately is the area of reproductive rights, because you mentioned Michelle Bachelet. Michelle Bachelet, before leaving government, introduced a new a bill allowing abortion in 3 cases: when the mother is in danger, when the fetus is with malformation, there's no viability, and also in cases of rape. That was a whole issue, a very contentious issue in the country, because the right-wing politicians, the groups, pro-life groups linked to the Catholic Church, were all against that, and even the bill was approved finally, but in practice it hasn't been very effective, because doctors, the medical practitioners, have the right to object because of their values. So in practice, very few cases of women accessing abortion have been taking place. And it is still an issue that has to be solved. There is some legal discussion there, and it's still not completely solved. Because, as I said, many practitioners are rejecting practicing abortions, although the bill is there. So it's very contentious, because we have, on one hand, the feminist movement claiming for rights, but the conservative values shaping our society is always against it. And yeah, that's happened to Michelle Bachelet government.
Yeah, okay. I think that it's important to consider different points. First of all, okay, there is the best interest of the child. Is like a guide. Okay, I had no time to go deeply, but in the International Convention of the Children's Rights, is really clarify what means the best interest of the child, and, for example, the children's right to decide his attitude, the right to spend time with parents, even in case of separations, the right to be listened, and a lot of other things. And the way I underlined this is connected to Istanbul Convention. Why? Because Istanbul Convention is a law and is a guide also. Not a law. Okay, it's a convention, but it's when it's ratified. Yeah, I'm talking in this case. I'm talking for Italy because it's specific the region. So this is a guide for different type of professionists that are involved in domestic violence cases. The best interest of the child is something connected to this, because the context of my research, and I took this data in the region of Veneto and Friuli Venezia Giulia, but we can spend more time from some other regions, is about the patriarchal culture and the way, in this case, social workers are trained. In sense, what I mean, before starting the research, I read and studied the old books that social workers use during their university training, and in almost the old books there is a very deep patriarchal culture highlighted, a lot of stereotype about family, and the concept that the best interest of the child is only considering the traditional family structure. So, mom, dad, child, stop. And the point of view used by the professionist is this. So, when there is a case of domestic violence, the first thought is not, okay, what is happening now and what we can do, what the law in Italy says us we have to do something, okay? But is how we can make the family continue to be stay together. This is the point, I mean, the best interest of the child. The consequence is that really the actions can be very different. Because if we consider the violence, we can have a range of possibility. If we do not consider the violence, we can choose and take some very harmful decisions without the awareness of the consequences, sometimes, often, because really I found that a lot of social workers didn't know about, for example, Istanbul Convention. They really didn't know that he exists and is law in Italy. And even the religious point in our country is a big point about connected to the idea of family. So we know that different studies says us that children can feel much better with separated partners than partners and parents that stay together with a domestic violence situation during whole days and their lifetime, because there is then the problem of in the generational violence transmissions and the model of family that these children can put in their future life and the relationship also. I don't know if I could explain much better. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your appreciation. And yes, you're right. There are some groups in Spain and also in my city which are using Twitter on Facebook to promote the help to each other and to coordinate, to make some actions, and of course to help to new victims. And it is a good way to offer information to canalize that help. I think in using the same structure, more or less, we have to promote those channels. And even in my university, I have asked to create some channels to address anonymous questions and to provide some information about how to act. Because sometimes if the victims don't know where to go, how to do, to make an identification is something that make that the victim won't continue with the denounce. So I think Twitter, Facebook, and many other ways are really important and really useful ways to coordinate help between victims to other victims, but also in public administration to the victims. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Question from the audio web. Okay, now we start. Renate.
Thanks to all the panelists. Each presentation was very interesting. I have a question to Ignacio, and I'm intrigued by this dual focus on computer science and gender studies. In my experience working with universities to address violence against women within the remit of the university, I have found that many universities pay lip service to the problem and say the right things, but they are reluctant to change how they actually operate. So when you showed the results of your survey, it suggests that universities, through their computer centers, have the expertise to address cyber violence, but have so far not done so. And there's a lot of potential where they could do more. And my question is, from your interactions in the university and with computer scientists, do you have ideas of how you could entice or encourage universities, or their computer centers to become more proactive
Thank you. I have a question for Federica about your encounter with the professionals. And if you, in your experience, you found some other category when maybe discussing some cases of domestic violence involving migrant women, and if so, what did you discover on that point? And another not question but comment was for Ignacio, because I was also reflecting about how to enlarge awareness in the cyberspace about those themes, because I'm also part of an online platform of activists combating gender violence online. And I don't know, I wanted to know if there are other groups like that in your country, also to share opinion on that. And also what technical tools are provided by those groups, because sometimes the problem with us is the technical knowledge. It's on some people like you studied specific topics and you can provide technical tips to fight against these problems, but often all the other knowledge about gender sensitivity is on another level, so it's how to mix these, it's a very big problem.
Ask just one question to the last two contributors. It seems to me that you put an emphasis on training, both of you in different fields. So my question is there a margin to establish some kind of training, and whose responsibility is this? Who must take the decision to train social workers in your case and IT users in your case? Thank you.
The largest way, the largest way, the broadest way. Okay, I think another question. You? Okay. But perhaps you can answer to 3 questions, and then, or it's direct related to your question. Okay. Okay.
For instance, well, for instance, I think the 2 first questions are more or less related, connected. Yes, I think because one has the necessity and other people have the opportunity, the knowledge to solve the problem. But I think this is something I see continuously at my work. I am in my day-to-day, I am a civil servant at the unemployment service, and I see how people have some necessities of informatics, computer science, but they don't know that there is a possibility to make things easier or more effectively. And in the other side, people from informatics or computer science, they don't know that there is a problem. So I think we need to put in contact, to talk the 2 parts, to make a meeting to say, I need to do this. This is my necessities, and the other side to say, well, we can help you in this and this and in this, making these things or this strategy or whatever. I don't know, and I think that's a problem. In another vein, the graph I show you, that's a part of a study of the protocols, university protocols, to manage sexual harassment. I think, in my opinion, after reading 50 protocols, I think it is focused just on the, it is some kind of marketing, please understand me, because it is just to say, hey, we have a protocol, and it is with 50 pages, but it is not useful to manage a real case. Of course, they are not thinking in ICT or something like that. In fact, in Spain, we've got a law, a very big and very long law, to set how to make procedures in administration. And the protocols is exactly an adaptation of that law. To me, it's terrible because it is not usual. If a victim take the protocol and read it, of course they will say, okay, that's all. I don't need more information. And well, in another comment, yes, there are some groups working on it. Maybe I can say you later because by memory I don't know exactly. Well, they are trying to make a lot of publicity and trying to say that they are here, trying to help to victims. In computer science faculty, I think that in my university, there must be a subject specific of gender awareness or whatever. I think it is a good strategy to train computer science to help to victims. I don't know if I have answered more or less. Thank you.
Okay, I start from Veronica. I ask you if I understand properly the question. Did you mean some other categories inside the results? Okay, yeah. Yes, okay. This was really a brief about the whole results. And yeah, for example, talking about social workers' working conditions, we found really a big problem because you know, we are talking about two regions, Veneto and Friuli Venezia Giulia, and the realities in that part, okay, involved different type of characteristic, and I think that it's important to consider the context always when we do something and when we want to do something. In this case, for example, for a lot of social workers, there was a problem. I have like I'm trying to think the best words to explain this. Social workers work usually in a place, in an institute, in a place completely connected to the other part of the life of the town, and usually these perpetrators know very well where social worker lives, how many children has these social workers. In my transcriptions, it was clearly where they go to school, and they have this type of inside conflict between, okay, first of all, I know I have the knowledge or not. When I have the knowledge, what I should do, when I know that I should report something, okay, just a moment, this man told me clearly, I know where your children go to school. And what the results highlighted that often these type of things make the social worker stop to report something, or to make a relation really more diplomatic, can I say this? And this is one point, for example. Then there are a lot of other categories connected to the blame of the victim, to the consequences for the children, and for example, some other categories connected to the different part of the process. Because, for example, we have a separation, so a civil process. that has specific time, specific steps, and another, for example, penal process, in case of suspect of child abuse, for example, that has some other time, steps. Sometimes or often happens that in a penal process they have to decide if there is effectively an abuse, a child abuse, and we know that this should mean that parent visiting is stopped, and there are a lot of tools and steps. But what is happening now? That the time of the penal process is really much more than the civil. So in the civil we have the co-parenting, the visiting, and the time spent together. And in the process, in the penal process, we have ideologically to stop this type of visit, for example. And in my article, all these steps are explained much better, because there are a lot really of elements and transcriptions that explain all these type of categories. Yeah, and the other connected, yeah, I think university, yeah, and some other trainings specifically for the different type of professionists. So considering, as example, police, men and women, lawyers, psychologists, social workers, everybody, I think, are involved in this type of problem. First of all, university, like Professor Coloni do.
Okay, Christy, do you want to add something or no? No. Okay, the last round of questions. Okay, she was you, and the last question. No. Okay, no, she's.
So I wanted to ask Federica if you think that the lack, in some way, or that the majority of perpetrators are men. If that might also be because there's not much talk about female perpetrators, so that, for example, if mothers are sexually harassing or differently harassing, if they are more like packaging it as cuddling or in any other way a normal or an accepted form of behavior, and if this like impacts the child and people who listen to it and these kind of things. And then I had a question to Ignacio, because I think like in one of my master programs we had a lot of work online, and we often use platforms from like Microsoft, so like Windows and stuff. And I think that's very common in university. And here we are also like publishing our talks and stuff. And I think it's especially in our area, like in gender studies, it's often a neglected issue that you can use like digital information very well to not only categorize people, but also to like that we can get problems from what we're saying and writing online if, for example, governments change or if we travel somewhere else. And I think there's a lack of information on that, and if there are like projects that try to enhance this.
Thank you. The lady here, and if you can introduce, because.
So I have a question for Christy. You said before that so there is this problem in Chile that there is this cultural thing, and this as you said, this problem with their Catholic culture there. You said also that there is a student movement, feminist movement, but all the women, do they have this, are they having this change in their mind, their mentality about female abuse or not? Is it just like female students or younger girls, women that have started to think, okay, maybe this is a problem? Or is it also starting to come in their older women's mind that maybe there's a real problem to get abused by their father or husband?
Can you present yourself?
I'm Denise. I live in Trento, and I attend the Liceo Linguistico here in Trento. So yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
New generation. So
Yeah.
Of
Yeah, exactly.
potential or feminist or very
Yeah.
sensitive to. Okay.
Yeah.
So you were invited here from your liceo to come.
Yeah. So my English teacher wrote us an email telling us about this conference.
Great. Okay.
And
Great.
yeah.
Great.
So
Great.
yeah.
Because
So I
looked
decided.
that you were a little bit younger.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to say that.
Yeah. So yeah, I decided to come here.
Welcome. Very much.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. No other questions? No. Okay.
Okay.
The last.
Yes, so first of all is yes, and specifically this type of phenomenon really is a lot common acceptable, and there is a big problem with the blame, the victim blame, the survivor, the mother blame. For example, if a mom continues with a legal separation and she has children, she is typically considered a bad mom because she is destroying a family. And she is taking the daughter, the son, far from the father. In another case, if the same women stay there, she is considered a bad mom because she's not protected. She's not protecting her daughter or child from this violent father. This is the problem. For example, just one. I think I have answered to you about this. So knowledge has really to be improved a lot.
Well, firstly, sorry for my bad English. I understood that you answered me about the topics of my research. How can I manage ICT and gender studies? More or less. Yeah. Well, firstly, I think we can take advantage of ICT to, in some way, to manage gender-based violence and to protect victims. In fact, in my PhD in computer science, it is focused on how to manage diabetes mellitus with ICT, and I propose, and I have some papers in that issue, I propose a platform using ICT where caregivers can obtain information online continuously, 24 hours, and with some alerts and things like that. And I think we can do something more or less similar to manage in a better way than we are doing now gender-based victims. This is an issue, and in the other hand, I think I am also specialized in big data analysis. Well, the possibilities of big data is amazing. So the only thing I need is data. But if we have a very big database, we can obtain a lot of knowledge. So I am applying machine learning techniques to obtain some patterns and also to predict some situations in an area or whenever in the future. And well, that's what I'm doing, more or less. Thank you.
Yeah, to answer your question, it's a very interesting question, and I think it's something we have to study. But what is clear from the situation is that there was a first generation of feminist movement in Chile that, as I said, it was in the 80s during the dictatorship. And what happened to that feminist movement that got somehow co-opted by the democracy? With the democracy came all these international agreements, and the gender agenda became institutionalized, and it got like bureaucratic managerial tools, but not making real changes. Although there has been some progress, but not challenging too much these traditional values, and that was part of the Chilean style of the transition from dictatorship to democracy. and this agreement between the political parties and the Catholic power, not challenging too much traditional values because the family was considered sacred. So many feminists of that time surrendered to this agreement. And then now this new feminist movement, which is led by the student movement in the universities, is claiming that no, we have to change these traditional attitudes, we have to claim for women's rights, and they have been very strong, and they have faced the opposition of these pro-life groups and all that. And I think only time will say whether this will have the effects in the longer term. But at the moment, there have been some changes, as I said, within the universities. Now, some of them have protocols to deal with sexual harassment. Professor has been expelled from some universities with after these claims of sexual harassment, sexual misconduct. But I think it is important that the younger generation, it's very strong about the need to change culture, the need to change these gender roles, and demanding that the state and the institutions do their duty to protect women's rights, which is important.
Thank you very much to our presenter for their brilliant presentation, inspiring. Now our conference coming to an end. I would like to invite Professor Barbara Poggi, Pro-Rector for Equal Opportunities and Anti-Discrimination, and Professor Michele Nicoletti, and our brilliant, excellent main organizer, Professor, as you want, Giovanna Covi. Oops, it's not okay.
Sì. Okay, so just a few words to say that I was very pleased to be here today with you. I, on behalf of the University of Trento, as Vice Rector, and on behalf of the Center for Interdisciplinary Gender Studies that I coordinate, I wish to thank in particular Giovanna Covi and Michele Nicoletti and Marina Calloni, all the UNIRE network for organizing this conference. I'm very sorry I wasn't able to be here yesterday, but I had the opportunity to arrive for the final performance.
We considered you here.
Okay, thank you. And also I was here this morning, and I had the opportunity to follow all your presentation, very brilliant, very rich, and particularly interdisciplinary, and this is very important for us. The University of Trento and the Center for Interdisciplinary Gender Studies are very involved in promoting gender and equality. In particular, the Center for Interdisciplinary Gender Studies, that was founded in 2007, is involved in several activities for promoting and encouraging gender studies, such as postgraduate events as today, seminars, conferences, and also projects and experimentation on gender. And our interests are focused on several issues. Gender is a very big issue, and so there are different objects of research and of study. We work on labor markets and education and gender asymmetries in them, gender asymmetries in politics, gender language, gender and health, and particularly in gender and violence, that is some of mainstream issues. And we use a cultural perspective, and this was also the mark of this, characteristic of the conference, and so it was interesting to look at how gender violence can be studied from different perspectives or with a cultural lens. And that's it. And so I'm so happy that you are here. And I hope that there will be other opportunities to have you as host in our events in the future. So thanks to everybody. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you. Yeah. Yeah. First of all, let me also thank Joanna and Lisa and Livia also for organizing this first graduate conference in the framework of our UNIRE project. Our speaker, Renate Klein, and Simona, who was with us yesterday, and all of you who decided to accept our invitation and to be the real subjects, active subjects of our conference, and Barbara Poggio, of course, for the support of our university. It was quite a challenge to organize this first conference on cultural issues, and it is thanks to Giovanna that we decided to focus our first meeting on cultural issues. It is quite common to discuss about legislation or other strategies, social work, of course, which are very important, but we thought that the University of Trento and Giovanna in particular could give a big contribution in this field. And we are very happy that violence against women involve scholar researchers from all the different faculties and departments. And when we decided to start with the initiative of the prize for the best dissertation related to the Istanbul Convention, we strongly invited students from humanities or from information technologies, and I appreciate that this morning we had a presentation in this field. So I think that it was a good start and it was a success. And I have learned a lot about the importance of culture in this field. The lecture of Renate Klein was really very enlightening with all these 4 points on culture. And we learned also that it is not only important to interpret culture, but to make culture, as Giovanna pointed out. And we had a very nice performance yesterday, and this is the right way to go on. I would like to say another couple of things. The importance of institutions. You know that this project is supported by universities, but also by institutions like the Council of Europe. And I think that we need to have the institutions on board. This morning we heard something very important for me as a political philosopher about the complicity of the state, the relationship between violence against women and democracy or dictatorships. And today we are experiencing again illiberal democracy, authoritarian regimes, and so on, and maybe this has something to do, or a lot to do, also with violence against women and human rights violations and so on. The other point is about ontology, if I may, as a philosopher, because in the first presentation I heard these words, so impressive. Family as a higher state of being. said by an academic, if I remember correctly. Well, here there is something which is important, not only for women, but for every human being. Again, as Giovanna said yesterday, it is a question of justice. If we think, or if somebody thinks that there is a higher state of being, a higher form of being than the single human being, well, everybody of us is in danger. Family, nation, tribe, state, whatever you want. Everybody of us is in danger. What we want to protect is the human person and her dignity. And this was really a crucial point in our discussion. So, thank you very much. It was a great start. And I would appreciate very much, and Marina and Joanna would appreciate certainly if you as participants to this conference could give us your feedback, your comments, your reactions about contents, methodologies, organization of this kind of meetings. So since we will organize other meetings in other universities, maybe in other countries, devoted to young scholars and graduate students especially, it would be very important for us to have some feedback, and I really hope that you enjoyed this conference and that you have created in these 2 days a bit of network among you. I hope that you will keep in touch among you and with us all and help this project to go on. So thank you.
Great, thank you.
No, it's better if Giovanna could conclude. I say that is, I'm very much appreciating your contributions, and mainly also the talk of a younger generation. And we hope to have your address for our database, so that when we'll start with the European international network, you could be informed about our activity, because we are in the first phase of our project that is to consolidate the network and to invite all Italian universities, 96 private and public, to join our network. So you will receive in the next future our information when we'll have the second step about our program. So thank you very much, and thank you, Giovanna and Barbara and Michele, for the support.
Thank you again. What can I say without feeling that I'm keeping you hostage? I can only repeat myself. Really, it's been 16 good, very different panel contributions. You've taken us all over the place into disciplines that I'm not familiar with. Even though I was chairing, I was humbled by how can I chair and listen to papers that come from knowledges that I do not command. 2 great plenary lectures that have given us food for thinking. This is just the beginning. And I'm glad that the performance last night was acknowledged as a contribution to the conference. As I already said, not as entertainment, because that is really important to me. It was a way to say, how do I do culture? How do I make culture? Okay, I am in literature. I make culture with poetry. Rosa makes culture with dance. Riccardo makes culture with paintings. And it kind of came together to allow us, hopefully, to see how we can rethink the common representation of gender violence. Yes, indeed, it is a question of democracy and a question of justice. There's no compromise here that can be accepted. and therefore it is a huge challenge. I'm only repeating Michele Nicoletti's words here. Thank you for giving me a good lead. It's probably an impossible challenge. I must say that as the organizer of this conference, that I strongly wanted to be on culture, precisely because I come from the experience of having been in the committee for the prize to doctoral dissertation and MA thesis on violence, an experience that was very fruitful for a couple of years, and having noticed how the humanities are underrepresented, especially in comparison with studies in law, in the social sciences, economics. We're dwarfed by that. Even though, some work is being done, I thought, okay, I can launch a conference on the cultural aspects of gender violence. And yet here I am, a teacher in literature, and have not received a single proposal coming from literature. So you see, this is very much the beginning. We have a lot of work to do. I have failed. So I want another conference. We need to continue. We need to pursue this task because it is absolutely crucial. Article 14 in the Istanbul Convention tells us that we need to do educational work. How do you do educational work without the material? We need to produce cultural material in order to change those minds, right? Not only in schools, but certainly also in universities, because universities are also those that kind of legitimate the kind of culture that we want to circulate as widely as possible in our very, very imperfect and now endangered democracies. But the university is the space in which we can still think, enjoy the luxury to think. So we need to equip the universities with the right tools to think differently, because thinking differently is the beginning of giving some fuel to this change. So culture must be taken seriously as a practice. Perhaps impossible. We took the risk as non-experts, non-professional, 4 friends last night to give you that proposal. And I'm glad that you have agreed that it moves in the right direction. Nobody will tell us how to do it. It's not been done before. This is really prehistory. Imagining a humanity without gender violence is a creative act, and therefore a cultural act, because a society like that does not exist in reality yet. So feel free to use fiction, to use poetry, to use music, because that's all we have to imagine things differently. Because things are not that good yet, okay? So, yes, culture is a partner of any other kind of knowledge. It is transversal, it is spread around, but this is not a good reason to say that it is just a qualifier, that it is just a word, right? We need to find ways to say, okay, now I'm going to sit down and make a culture that is a little bit more hospitable and friendly to my own being in this world. So with this conviction, a little bit passionate, I'm going to thank you again. It's been 2 wonderful days. It's given me lots of hope that the UNIRE network will grow. You'll bring it back to your universities, I hope. Give us your feedback. Anything we did wrong, we'll try to correct. And let's stay in touch and become bigger and bigger. Thank you again.